The winter of 1887 had settled over the small, Ohio township like a suffocating blanket. Snow drifted lazily along the narrow lanes, and the wind moaned through the skeletal trees surrounding the farmhouse. Diana had awakened that morning to the familiar, hollow quiet that had grown heavier over the past months. Her father, once a man whose voice carried authority and warmth through every room, had become fragile, blind, and utterly reliant upon her. The sight of him now, sitting motionless in the corner of the parlor with his hands folded over his lap, stirred an unease she had tried to ignore for years. Yet in that unease a part of her felt liberated, even though she had not yet acted. For weeks Diana had wrestled with the same gnawing thought. She could not spend the rest of her life tethered to a man who could no longer see her, yet had once guided her through every choice she had made. The villagers whispered about her father's condition, about how a man so proud had been reduced to dependence, and those whispers burrowed into Diana's mind. She had always been a dutiful daughter, but obedience had begun to feel like a chain. That morning, the wind outside seemed to carry with it the faint scent of freedom, or perhaps it was just the cold seeping into her bones that made her desire it. Her father's voice, though dim and uneven, called her name. "Diana," he said, "are you there?" There was no accusation in it, no sharpness, only the quiet trust of a man who had believed in her all his life. She hesitated, the floorboards creaking under her boots as she approached him. She touched his shoulder gently. "I'm here, Father," she murmured. He smiled faintly, the lines of his face etched deeper by the shadows of the room. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "Does something weigh upon you, child?" Diana swallowed. Her throat had dried, and she could feel the pulse of unease thrum through her chest. I have much to think about," she whispered, the words tasting like betrayal as they passed her lips. She had rehearsed 1,000 excuses, but none of them felt true. None could justify the restlessness that had been consuming her. He did not press her further. He had always known when silence carried meaning, and he had learned patience over a long life of storms. Yet as he remained seated, his breathing shallow and measured, a sudden awareness struck Diana with full force. Time was slipping away. The man who had taught her to walk, to speak, to navigate the world, was fading, and her selfish desire for release from duty clawed at her, with an intensity she could neither resist nor deny. By mid-morning she had made her decision. She packed the small trunk she had been keeping for months, lining it with clothes she had never worn beyond the house, and a few coins she had managed to hide from her father. She paused at the door, looking back at him, and for the first time she saw clearly the frailty, the complete trust, the vulnerability of a man who had once been a fortress of guidance in her life. "I must leave, Father," she said softly, almost pleading with herself to believe that it was necessary. "Diana!" His voice faltered, but there was no anger, only confusion, the faintest tremor of fear that she had rarely, if ever, seen. I have obligations," she continued, the lie tasting bitter as it left her mouth. "I must see the world, find my own way. You understand, do you not?" He remained silent for a long moment, his blind eyes directed toward her, though unable to see. Finally he whispered, "I've understood many things, child, yet this cuts deeper than I can speak." Diana turned away, gripping the handle of her trunk, and walked out into the cold morning. The snow crunched beneath her boots, each step echoing louder than it should have, as though the earth itself mourned her departure. Behind her the parlor remained still, the man within it left to the darkness of a room that had once been filled with laughter, guidance, and warmth. Days passed, and with each passing hour, Diana told herself the same story. She had done what was necessary for herself, what was inevitable. Yet the relief she expected did not come. Every night as she lay under unfamiliar roofs in towns she had traveled to, the memory of her father's quiet, accusatory whisper haunted her. She could still hear the tremor in his voice, feel the weight of his disappointment, pressing against her chest as though it had followed her through every mile. One evening, after weeks of wandering, she found herself in a small village tavern. The fire in the hearth crackled and spat sparks, and the warmth should have comforted her. Yet she sat alone, nursing a cup of bitter tea, feeling a hollowness that no comfort could fill. Patrons laughed and spoke of matters she could not bring herself to care about, their lives running forward in a way hers could never return to. And in the corner of her mind, she heard the voice of the man she had abandoned, whispering again, a sound that had begun to gnaw at her sanity. "You cannot outrun what you have done." Diana's dreams were no refuge. Each night, she saw the farmhouse behind her father's blind gaze, empty hallways echoing with the sounds of her absence. She saw his hands reaching for her, fumbling in the darkness, and she could not move, could not speak. She awoke in a sweat, heart hammering, and felt as though the past had caught her, dragging her back into the room she had fled. It was during one of these nights that Diana encountered a traveler in the village who spoke of a woman in a neighboring county who had left a parent behind, only to be haunted by misfortune and loneliness. The story struck her like a blow, not because of its content, but because she saw herself mirrored in it. Her own guilt, suppressed for weeks, erupted into a tangible force she could neither deny nor escape. She realized then that the consequences of cruelty were not delayed. They followed, relentless, shaping life in ways one could never anticipate. Weeks turned into months, yet the memory of her father never dulled. Every stranger's glance, every sigh of pain she witnessed in others, reminded her of what she had left behind. And when news finally reached her of his death, delivered with quiet condolences from a passing merchant who had once called upon the farmhouse, Diana was forced to confront the finality of her choices. She was too far to reach him, too late to say the words she had withheld for so long. And yet, even in his death, he had spoken to her. The man who had trusted, guided, and loved her had left her with words that would carve into her soul. "Remember, Diana, the heart you abandon will remember you forever." That night, under the cold Ohio sky, Diana wept not just for the man she had left behind, but for the cruelty within herself, for the life she had sacrificed for fleeting freedom, and for the haunting realization that regret was a companion she could never escape. She wondered aloud, her voice trembling, "Father, do you forgive me?" But only the wind answered, and only the snow bore witness. After months of wandering from town to town, Diana had learned the cold reality of freedom. It was not a gift, it was a burden cloaked in distance. The streets she walked were lined with strangers, whose lives seemed full, yet hollow in their own way. Every smile she saw, every laugh she overheard, reminded her of what she had left behind. She carried her father's absence like a stone in her chest, pressing her forward and pulling her backward all at once. Nights were worse. Sleep offered no reprieve. Shadows of the farmhouse crept into her room, filling corners with the echo of his silent calls. In one small village, she took lodging in a modest inn, whose walls had seen better days. The fire sputtered in the hearth, failing to cast warmth beyond the immediate circle of light. She sat there staring at the flames, drinking tea that had long grown cold, and felt the first true pangs of loneliness. Here she had no role, no purpose, no anchor. Her father's hands, frail yet firm in memory, seemed to hover over her own, as if reproaching every step she had taken. Weeks later, she found herself writing letters she would never send. Her pen hovered over the paper, trembling, as though the act itself could summon him back. She began to describe her travels, the people she had met, and the small comforts she had gathered along the way. Yet each line ended with the unspoken truth. She was fleeing a lifetime of obligation, and with every mile, she had abandoned the one who had never abandoned her. Each sentence was a confession she could not voice aloud, each word a hammer upon her conscience. The villagers began to notice her somber demeanor. Some whispered that she had suffered loss, others that she carried a secret shame. Diana ignored them all, but their curiosity and subtle judgment pierced her in ways no solitude ever could. It was in that small, judgmental silence that she began to understand the true cost of abandonment. It followed her, relentless, invisible, yet unavoidable. One evening, a traveling merchant arrived at the inn, a tall man with keen eyes who seemed to read her before she spoke. He took a seat beside her and offered a tale that made her blood run cold. He spoke of a daughter who had left her father in a distant county, believing her departure would bring relief. Yet the father had lingered, long enough to see the consequences of her actions ripple through the lives of others, and in her absence, the woman had been haunted by every whisper, every regret, until the day she died. Diana's hands tightened around her cup. The story was not unfamiliar. It mirrored her own life with frightening accuracy. She realized that the guilt she carried was not a punishment. It was a mirror of her own conscience. No matter how far she traveled, no matter what faces she passed, she could not escape what she had done. In the days that followed, she began noticing details she had once ignored. The blind man at the market struggling to find his way, the elderly mother scolding a reckless child, the faint cries of a woman mourning in her kitchen. Each scene struck her like a shard of glass, slicing through the fragile armor she had built to justify her departure. She had abandoned more than a man. She had abandoned a lifetime of lessons, of love, of humanity itself. Diana's sleep grew troubled. She dreamt of the farmhouse in Ohio, her father's hand reaching toward her, trembling in the dim candlelight. He spoke without words, yet the meaning was clear. "Why did you leave me?" She awoke in a sweat, the room around her unfamiliar, the fire reduced to embers, and she felt the weight of decades of absence pressing down upon her as if time itself had become a cage. As winter bled into spring, Diana wandered further, seeking work in neighboring towns. She took odd jobs, each more exhausting than the last, each demanding a skill she had never thought to learn. Yet even in labor, her thoughts returned inexorably to her father. The guilt was no longer a whisper. It had become a companion that followed her footsteps, tugging at her with invisible hands. She tried to speak to strangers of her past, to unburden herself, but no words could capture the depth of regret. And often, when she attempted, she was met with polite nods and sympathetic smiles that only emphasized her isolation. Then came the letter. It arrived without warning, carried by a slow courier, whose eyes betrayed no knowledge of the contents. Her hands shook as she tore it open, half fearing, half hoping. It was from a neighbor of her father's, detailing the final days she had missed. The description was blunt, factual, but each line carried a weight that no ink should bear. Her father had lingered in the cold parlor for weeks, calling for her, waiting for footsteps that would never come. He had asked for her by name, whispered apologies for the burdens he had imposed, hand-spoken of love that she had failed to reciprocate. And in his final moments he had uttered words meant only for her. "Diana, remember, the heart you abandon remembers you forever." The letter fell from her hands. She could feel the paper tremble beneath her, though the tremble was nothing compared to the shaking within her own chest. She was too late for apologies, too late for comfort, too late for anything. The words seared themselves into her mind, refusing to fade, refusing to let her rest. For weeks after reading the letter, Diana wandered aimlessly, unable to settle, unable to eat, unable to sleep without reliving the scene of abandonment. The weight of her choices pressed down, relentless and unforgiving. Each day brought a new echo of the past, the imagined sound of his cane tapping the floor, the scent of the farmhouse, the emptiness of rooms she would never again enter. She felt the cruelty she had enacted as a living thing, stalking her from town to town, a shadow that would not release its hold. One afternoon, in a small, crowded marketplace, she paused to watch an elderly man struggle to navigate the cobblestones. Blind, frail, and alone, he moved cautiously, relying on the kindness of strangers. Diana's chest tightened, and for a moment she saw her father in him, heard his voice in the man's muttered requests, felt the pangs of betrayal all over again. She closed her eyes, wishing she could turn back time, wishing she could undo the choices that had led her here, wishing for a mercy that history refused to grant. Her journey continued, each step haunted not by the world around her, but by the world she had left behind. The man she had abandoned had given her a gift she had not yet recognized, the chance to carry regret in its purest, most unforgiving form. And Diana realized, with a sorrow that threatened to consume her, that some lessons could only be learned too late, that some wounds never healed, and that the cruelty of abandoning love left marks deeper than the flesh, deeper than the mind, deeper than time itself. By the time summer arrived, Diana had reached another small township, and yet the seasons had done nothing to ease her conscience. The world moved on around her, oblivious to the suffering she carried, and she felt herself trapped between the life she had chosen and the life she had forsaken. Each day was a reminder that freedom, when bought at the cost of cruelty, was never truly free. The silence of her father's empty home followed her everywhere, shaping her days, haunting her nights, and ensuring that no laughter, no comfort, no fleeting joy could ever fully reach her. And as she settled into the quiet of an unfamiliar room, staring at the shadows cast by a setting sun, Diana whispered aloud, though no one could hear, "Father, do you see me now? Do you know I'm sorry?" But only the wind answered, carrying the echoes of a home she had abandoned and a heart she could never reclaim. The summer sun hung heavy over the Ohio countryside, yet it brought no warmth to Diana's heart. Towns blurred into one another as she drifted, restless and uneasy. She took on odd chores in kitchens, farms and small shops, always moving on before anyone could notice her prolonged melancholy. Yet no matter how far she traveled, the past followed with relentless persistence. She could not escape the memory of her father's blind eyes, the tremor in his hands, the silence that had filled the farmhouse after she had left. One afternoon, in a market on the edge of a bustling town, she overheard a conversation that made her chest tighten with dread. A pair of women spoke in hushed tones about a blind man who had died, alone in a farmhouse, abandoned by the daughter he loved. Diana's hand clenched around the handle of her basket as her mind replayed the scene she had fled months before. Every detail they mentioned, the cold rooms, the unlit hearth, the calls that went unanswered, was painfully accurate. Her heart pounded, and a cold sweat trickled down her spine. The cruelty she had enacted was no longer abstract. It had become a public fact, carried in whispers through the countryside, her shame trailing her like a shadow she could never outrun. Later that evening, she found lodging in a small inn that smelled of damp wood and stale ale. She sat in the corner, avoiding the eyes of patrons, and tried to focus on the rhythm of her own breathing. But sleep came fitfully, each dream dragging her back to the farmhouse. She saw her father reaching for her across the darkened floor, the final words he had spoken ringing like a death knell. "The heart you abandon remembers you forever." The next morning, Diana wandered along a path lined with wildflowers that swayed lazily in the summer breeze. The beauty of the landscape should have offered solace, but it only reminded her of the life she had turned away from. She imagined her father's fingers brushing over the petals in the garden she had once tended, the careful way he had shown her the first buds of spring. Each memory was a dagger, each image a reminder of her cruelty. Her wandering led her to a small farm, where a kindly widow had taken in children whose parents had died or abandoned them. Diana had thought herself alone in regret, yet seeing these children, hungry for attention and guidance, stirred something deep within her. She recognized in their eyes the same trust her father had once placed in her. The realization hit hard. Cruelty begets cruelty. Abandonment begets loneliness. And the cost of selfish choices was measured not only in her own guilt, but in the suffering of others who depended on love that she had withdrawn. Over the following weeks, Diana stayed on the farm, helping with chores, cooking meals, and attempting to care for the children. Yet even amid the bustle of work, her father's absence haunted every action. She scolded herself for every kind word she offered, imagining that she was trying to replace the love she had failed to give him. One child, a small boy named Samuel, would often approach her with wide eyes, asking if she had a family. She could not speak the truth, could not say that she had abandoned her father, and the lie lodged itself in her throat like a stone. Late one night, Diana sat alone on the porch, the moonlight washing over the fields, and wrote in her journal. She tried to capture her thoughts, but the words seemed pale and inadequate. How could a heart that once held so much love become so cruel? She wrote, "How could I have fled the one man who gave me everything?" Each word was soaked in remorse, yet writing offered only a fraction of relief. The letter to her father she had never sent now felt meaningless. He was gone, and she had no chance to make amends. Then a stranger arrived at the farm. He was a traveling preacher, old but with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority. He noticed Diana's somber demeanor and spoke to her about mercy, forgiveness, and the weight of conscience. Diana listened, yet his words, though gentle, only deepened her awareness of the past she could not change. Forgiveness seemed an impossible luxury, reserved for others but never for her. The preacher paused before leaving, and with a quiet intensity said, "The sins of the heart are never hidden from the one who carries them." His words haunted her more than the preacher could know. She realized that she had carried the cruelty in her own heart long before any town or neighbor had noticed. Abandonment had not freed her. It had bound her tighter to her father's memory. Every smile she forced, every task she completed, was shadowed by the guilt that no labor could lift. As summer waned, Diana became restless again. The farm offered distraction, but no absolution. She left quietly one morning, leaving behind the children she had grown fond of, and the widow who had welcomed her. The road ahead felt endless, yet she could not stay. She feared that staying too long would only reveal to others the depth of her own failings, and the truth of her father's abandonment would consume her. One evening, as she walked along a forest path, Diana encountered a man who had been injured by a falling branch. Alone, weak and bleeding, he struggled to move. Instinctively, she offered assistance, guiding him to a nearby clearing, where she made a crude splint. As she worked, she realized that her own skill and care were fueled not by compassion, but by the memory of her father, the desire to redeem herself, however temporarily. The man looked at her with gratitude. Yet she felt no peace, only the gnawing certainty that she could never undo the past. Her nights grew longer, her sleep ever more haunted. She dreamt vividly of the farmhouse, her father's hand stretching toward her, trembling, unable to grasp the daughter who had once been his world. Each dream ended with the same words, "The heart you abandon remembers you forever." And each morning, she awoke drenched in sweat, the memory of guilt clinging to her as tightly as the cold Ohio air. By the time autumn arrived, Diana had traveled nearly 100 miles from the farmhouse, yet the past remained inescapable. She saw reminders everywhere, in the frail, blind men struggling in the markets, in mothers scolding inattentive children, in the quiet despair of strangers whose eyes reflected absence and loss. The cruelty she had enacted had rippled outward, and she began to comprehend the magnitude of her abandonment. It had been more than a personal failure. It had been an act that resonated through the lives of others, echoing the pain of neglect she had inflicted on the one who had loved her unconditionally. And so, as autumn leaves fell and the first chill of winter crept into the air, Diana continued her journey, haunted by a past she could not escape, tormented by guilt that would not let her rest. Every town, every stranger, every moment of solitude served as a reminder. Some actions could never be undone, some cruelty never forgiven. Can some hearts never release those who abandon them? Even as she pressed onward, she could not stop asking herself, aloud and in whispers, "Father, do you see me now? Can you forgive me?" Yet only the wind answered, rustling through the leaves, carrying with it the bitter, unyielding truth that some regrets endure forever. The first frost of winter crept across the Ohio countryside, coating fields in brittle silver and transforming familiar paths into treacherous stretches of ice. Diana trudged along one such path, her coat pulled tightly around her, though the layers could not shield her from the cold or from the weight pressing on her chest. Months of wandering had changed little. Her father's absence clung to her as persistently as the frost clung to the trees. She had begun to realize that distance offered no reprieve, and that guilt had a way of following footsteps no matter how many miles were put between past and present. In a small township, she heard rumors of a man who had died alone, abandoned by his daughter. At first, she assumed it could not be her father. She had not left anyone there long enough to stir such attention. Yet as she listened, her heart twisted in recognition. The villagers described the cold farmhouse, the unlit hearth, the calls that went unanswered, and the whispered prayers that had gone unheard. She felt the sting of shame like a lash across her face, the knowledge that the cruelty she had enacted was no longer hers alone to bear. It had seeped into the lives of those around her, infecting the memory of a man who had trusted her utterly. That evening, Diana found herself seeking shelter in a deserted chapel. The pews were empty, the air thick with incense and neglect, but the quiet offered her a moment of reflection. She knelt before the altar, pressed her palms together, and whispered into the cold stone walls, "Father, I was wrong. I could not see, but I understand now." The words were hollow, unconvincing even to her own ears. The silence of the chapel answered back as though mocking her, reminding her that forgiveness was not hers to command. Days passed in a haze of labor and wandering. Diana took work wherever she could, helping farmers repair barns, tending to livestock, or cooking for strangers who had no interest in the woman with haunted eyes. Yet every action was filtered through the lens of guilt. She moved with precision, spoke with care. Yet her mind replayed the parlor she had left behind. Each laugh she heard, each child she saw playing under the winter sun, reminded her of the absence she had created. Her father's blindness, his dependence and his final words had formed a chain around her, heart that no physical distance could sever. One bitter morning, she arrived at a farmhouse where the owner had recently lost his wife. The widow's children were quiet, withdrawn and wary of strangers, and Diana felt a pang of recognition in their silence. She offered her help, tending to the youngest while the widow attended to chores in the kitchen. The child, a girl of 6 with wide, searching eyes, reached for Diana's hand, and she flinched. The memory of her father's frailty struck with renewed force. Every touch, every act of care reminded her of what she had left behind, of the warmth she had denied, of the comfort she had abandoned. That night, sleep offered no relief. Diana dreamed of the farmhouse in Ohio, the cold parlor lit by a single candle, her father seated in his chair, his hand trembling as he reached for her. He spoke in whispers that became screams in her mind. "The heart you abandon remembers you forever. The love you ignore will not forgive." She awoke in a cold sweat, the shadows of the room twisting into shapes of regret and accusation. Her own reflection in the window seemed a stranger, a woman marked by cruelty, haunted by absence. The weeks that followed brought news that made the sting of abandonment more tangible. Letters from neighbors recounted the final days of her father, how he had longed for her, how he had waited in vain, how the farmhouse had grown silent and cold. Each word struck Diana like a physical blow. She had imagined that her escape would grant freedom, but the truth was far harsher. Her freedom had been an illusion. In reality, she had trapped herself in a cage built of remorse, one that the passage of months had only strengthened. One evening, Diana sought out a traveling scholar who had come to town to lecture on morality and the weight of conscience. She listened as he spoke of accountability, of the ripple effects of neglect, and of the burden carried by those who abandon the vulnerable. The lecture struck her with painful clarity. Cruelty, once committed, does not vanish. It lingers, festers, and shapes every action that follows. She left the lecture hall with her heart pounding, the scholar's words echoing like her father's final admonition. As winter deepened, Diana came upon a small village where a fire had destroyed several homes. Among the ruins, she recognized the faces of the vulnerable, elderly men and women, children left orphaned, and families rendered helpless by misfortune. She assisted where she could, carrying supplies, tending to injuries, and offering comfort. Yet even in her deeds, she could not escape the realization that her efforts were small, fleeting, and could never repair what she had done. Her father's absence overshadowed her every act of kindness. The more she tried to atone, the more she understood that some cruelty leaves wounds too deep to heal. One night, as she walked alone through the snowy streets of the village, she heard a voice calling her name. She turned sharply, heart hammering, but saw no one. The wind carried whispers that seemed familiar, almost like the timbre of her father's voice. "Diana, the heart you abandon remembers you forever." She stumbled to a bench, clutching it for support, and realized that the past was no longer a memory. It was a living presence, following her, pressing upon her, ensuring that she could never escape. She thought of the children she had briefly cared for, the widows she had aided, the strangers she had touched with fleeting kindness. All of it seemed hollow compared to the irrevocable act she had committed. Her father's trust, his unconditional love, his final words, they overshadowed every good she attempted. Each step she took was a reminder that some actions cannot be undone, some hearts never release those who abandon them, and some regrets endure beyond a lifetime. By the time the first snow of the new year began to fall, Diana had reached the outskirts of another township. Exhausted, hollow, and haunted, she paused to gaze at the horizon. The wind carried the faint smell of wood smoke, the distant echo of laughter, and yet her heart remained heavy. Burdened by the weight of cruelty and regret, she whispered to the emptiness, "Father, do you know I have tried? Do you know I remember?" But the wind answered nothing, and only the falling snow bore witness to a daughter who had abandoned her father, and a heart that would never forgive itself. The bitter wind of late winter cut through Diana's coat like a knife, and she shivered as she trudged along a narrow country road. Every step reminded her that she had chosen a path she could never return from. Towns passed in a blur, their faces indifferent to the silent torment that followed her. Yet no matter how far she went, she could not escape the shadow of the farmhouse, the empty parlor, the blind eyes that had trusted her utterly. She arrived at a small village, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the streets bathed in a cold silver light. Exhausted, she sought refuge in a modest inn, its walls cracked and worn, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke and unwashed linens. She paid for a room with the coins she had carried from town to town. Yet even the small comfort of warmth and shelter could not reach the hollowness in her chest. Every corner, every creaking floorboard reminded her that she had left something irreplaceable behind. That night sleep did not come. Instead, Diana lay awake, haunted by memories she could no longer suppress. She saw her father's hands trembling as he reached for her, heard his whispered pleas echoing through the darkness, and felt the cold draft of the empty farmhouse pressing against her. She had fled in search of freedom, but the past had followed her like a relentless spectre, ensuring that every moment of her life would be shadowed by what she had abandoned. Days passed in a haze of labor and wandering. Diana found work wherever she could. She tended to farm animals, cooked meals for strangers, and washed clothes in freezing rivers. Each act of service was tinged with guilt, for she knew that no good she did could repay the love she had left behind. Her father's absence haunted her in every interaction, every trust she was offered, every plea for help she encountered became a mirror of the cruelty she had committed. One evening, a messenger arrived at the inn, bearing a letter that would forever change the course of Diana's understanding of her actions. The envelope was plain, the handwriting familiar, and her hands shook as she tore it open. The letter recounted the final days of her father with precise, unflinching detail. He had grown weaker with each passing week, waiting for her steps on the cold floorboards, listening for the sound of her voice, calling her name until his lips could form no more words. And in his last moments he had spoken only to her. "Diana, the heart you abandon remembers you forever." The words fell from the page, yet they seemed to cling to the room around her. Diana sank to the floor, trembling, tears freezing on her cheeks. The truth she had avoided now stood before her in undeniable clarity. She had caused suffering, and it was irrevocable. The cruelty of her choice was no longer an abstract thought. It had materialized into a lifetime of relentless regret. In the weeks that followed, Diana wandered the countryside with a new awareness. She noticed every blind man struggling along the paths, every elderly figure stumbling under the weight of their own frailty, every family fractured by absence or neglect. Each sight pierced her heart, a reminder that her abandonment had not existed in isolation, but as part of a larger pattern of cruelty that seemed to stretch endlessly through the lives of others. She began to understand that the consequences of a single selfish act could ripple far beyond the immediate moment, leaving marks on those who had no part in the original decision. One cold morning, she encountered a small girl whose mother had died in childbirth. The child clung to her, frightened and hungry, and Diana felt a surge of protective instinct. Yet even as she offered comfort, she could not escape the memory of her father's dependence. The warmth she had forsaken found the trust she had shattered. Caring for the child was not redemption. It was only a shadow of what she had lost. The realization struck her with brutal clarity. Her actions could not be undone, and no act of kindness could erase the past. By midwinter, Diana had become a figure known to some for her quiet assistance. Yet few truly knew her story. She carried her guilt as a secret, invisible yet crushing. Each night she would retreat to her room, staring into the fire and imagining the parlor she had left behind. She saw the frozen floorboards, the candlelight flickering against her father's face, the hand that had reached for her one last time. She whispered into the darkness, "Father, I am sorry." But the room offered no answer. Only the wind responded, cold and unyielding, echoing the finality of her abandonment. One evening, as Diana walked along a snow-covered road, she came upon a group of travelers huddled near a dying fire. Among them was an elderly blind man leaning on a cane, struggling to stay upright in the biting wind. Instinctively, Diana approached, offering support, guiding him to shelter. The man's eyes, though blind, seemed to see through her, and a faint voice carried across the fire. "You have known loss, child. You carry a burden that will not let you rest." The words struck her like a thunderclap. He did not know her story, yet he had spoken a truth she could not deny. As she continued her journey, Diana's guilt evolved from memory into a constant companion, pressing on her chest with unrelenting force. Every step, every encounter, every act of care was haunted by the shadow of the man she had abandoned. She realized with a despair that threatened to consume her that some acts of cruelty could never be redeemed, and some hearts, once broken by abandonment, remembered forever. By the end of winter, Diana found herself on the outskirts of a village where the winds had stripped, the trees bare and the earth was frozen, hard beneath her feet. She paused to look back toward the hills, toward the distant path that had once led her away from the farmhouse, and for a moment She felt the weight of all the miles she had traveled, the freedom she had sought, the regrets she had gathered, the cruelty that clung to her like ice. She whispered aloud, shivering in the wind, "Father, can you forgive me?" But only silence answered. The snow fell softly, covering the tracks she had left behind, erasing them as though the world itself wished to deny her passage. Yet the past remained etched into her heart, as relentless and unforgiving as the winter wind itself. Diana realized with a painful clarity that some actions could never be undone, some cruelty could never be mended, and some hearts never forget. And in that frozen silence, she understood that she would carry the weight of her choices forever, haunted by the final words of a father who had loved her unconditionally, and who had known, too late, that love alone could not protect her from the consequences of abandoning it. Spring arrived slowly, a pale sun warming the frozen fields, yet Diana felt no warmth in her heart. The melting snow revealed the earth beneath, scarred and uneven, much like the life she carried within her. Every path she walked seemed to lead her deeper into reflection, deeper into the realization that she could no longer outrun what she had done. Her father's absence had grown into a tangible presence, a shadow she could feel pressing against her shoulders, whispering in the quiet moments when she thought herself alone. Diana arrived at a township on the outskirts of Ohio, smaller than those she had traversed before, yet brimming with life. Families bustled through narrow streets. Vendors shouted their wares, and children ran and played in the open square. To any passerby, she would appear as just another weary traveler, but she could not escape the echoes of her past, the laughter of children, the bustling energy of families, and the quiet contentment of those who loved and were loved. All of it reminded her of what she had abandoned. That evening, she took lodging in a modest inn, whose windows looked out over the town square. The room was small and sparsely furnished, yet even in its simplicity, Diana could not find peace. She sat by the window, tracing patterns in the frost that clung stubbornly to the glass, and thought of her father. His voice, his touch, his unwavering love, all haunted her with a clarity that left her breathless. She pressed her hand to the cold pane, imagining his fingers there, imagining that he could still reach for her, and felt a surge of despair that she could not name. The next morning, as she wandered through the square, Diana noticed a small crowd gathered near the edge of town. Curiosity drew her closer, and she saw the source of the gathering. An old man, blind, struggling to make his way across uneven cobblestones. Diana's steps faltered. She knew in an instant that she was witnessing a reflection of her father, the helplessness she had once fled, now incarnated before her eyes. She approached cautiously, her voice low and trembling. "Sir, may I help you?" The man turned his face toward her voice, and for a moment, Diana felt as though time itself had stilled. He was not her father, no, she could see that, but the recognition of vulnerability, the trust placed in a stranger, struck her like a physical blow. She guided him gently, supporting his weight, and for the first time in months, the act of care did not feel hollow. Yet even as she assisted him, the memory of her father's abandonment pressed down like a stone. The reality was unyielding. No act, however noble, could restore what she had forsaken. That night, she sat by the fire in her room, her hands shaking as she wrote once more in her journal. She chronicled her journey, the people she had helped, and the lessons she had learned through suffering. Each word was steeped in guilt, each sentence a confession she could never voice aloud, and yet, in the act of writing, she sensed a faint glimmer of clarity. Her cruelty had left marks not only on her father, but on herself, and the only path forward was to confront the past she had abandoned so long ago. The decision did not come easily. Diana knew that returning to the farmhouse would be a journey through shame, through the bitter acknowledgement of what she had done. But the months of wandering had taught her that evasion offered no comfort, only prolonging the inevitable confrontation with conscience. She packed her belongings carefully, each motion deliberate, and set out toward the town she had fled so many months before. The journey was arduous, her legs stiff from disuse and the long winter months, but she walked with a determination she had never known, and, understanding that at long last, she would face the consequences of her actions. As she neared the familiar hills of Ohio, the memories returned in full force, the creaking floorboards, the unlit hearth, the cold light of the parlor where she had abandoned her father. She saw vividly the final moments she had fled from, the tremor in his hand as he reached for her, and the sorrow etched into the lines of his face. She stopped at the edge of the road, trembling, unsure if she had the courage to enter the place she had left behind. But the burden of guilt, heavier than any fear, propelled her forward. The farmhouse, when she arrived, was silent and abandoned. Windows were shuttered, doors closed, yet Diana could feel the weight of absence pressing from within. She stepped inside cautiously, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet, and for a moment it felt as though she were trespassing in a sacred space. Dust coated every surface, yet the memory of her father lingered like a living presence. She moved through the rooms slowly, pausing at the parlor where he had sat, and felt the full force of her remorse. In the corner, she imagined him still seated, blind eyes searching for her, hands trembling with need and love. She sank to the floor, unable to hold back the tears that had been building for months. "Father, I am here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I have returned. Please forgive me." She pressed her hands to the empty air, as if he could feel her touch, and for the first time, truly understood the depth of her cruelty. The silence answered, unyielding and absolute. Yet in that silence, Diana felt the magnitude of her lesson. Some wounds cannot be healed, some acts of abandonment cannot be undone, and some hearts, once broken, remember forever. Her father's final words, "The heart you abandon remembers you forever," echoed in her mind, a refrain that would accompany her for the rest of her life. She lingered in the farmhouse for hours, touching objects he had once used, imagining the life they had shared, the love that had been forsaken. The house, though empty, seemed alive with memory, and Diana realized that she could no longer escape the consequences of her actions. Her torment was no longer abstract. It was tangible, pressing against her chest with every breath she took. As night fell, Diana stepped outside into the cold Ohio air. The stars above seemed indifferent, the wind indifferent. Yet she felt a strange weight lift, not of absolution but of acknowledgement. She had confronted the past, faced the cruelty she had enacted, and allowed herself at last to fully recognize the consequences of her choices. Yet the regret remained, persistent and unyielding, a companion she would carry forever. In that moment, Diana understood something essential. She could never reclaim what she had lost, could never undo the abandonment, could never escape the shadow of her father's memory. All she could do was live with the weight of her choices, honor the lessons of cruelty and regret, and allow the past to shape the rest of her life. She whispered once more into the night, "Father, I am sorry," and though the wind answered nothing, she felt a fragile sense of resolve. Diana remained on the farmhouse threshold long after dawn had broken, the chill of early morning gnawing at her fingers and toes. The wind whispered through the barren trees, carrying with it the echoes of seasons she had never seen her father enjoy, the laughter she had never heard in response to her own. She could feel every year she had lost pressing against her chest, every choice she had made, weighing heavier than any burden she had carried along her journey. At last, with a trembling hand, she pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and old wood, yet there was a faint trace of her father's presence, a lingering essence that made her stomach twist. Sunlight streamed through grimy panes, illuminating the parlor where he had once sat. She moved slowly, reverently, as though any misstep might shatter the fragile bridge between memory and reality. Her eyes swept over the familiar furniture, the marks on the floor from a cane tapping time into the quiet, the empty chair where he had waited for her. Each sight pierced her like a blade, a visceral reminder of her abandonment. She sank into the chair he had once occupied, her knees trembling, and pressed her face to her hands. For a long moment there was only silence. Then, as though the room itself breathed with memory, she began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Father, I am so sorry. I left you alone. I was selfish. I was blind. I didn't understand. I didn't see how much you needed me. I was wrong." The words fell into the still air, yet the emptiness offered no forgiveness. The cruelty of her past actions, the finality of what she had done, settled over her like a heavy shroud. Every letter she had written, every tear she had shed, every act of kindness she had attempted along her wandering journey, none could bring him back. None could repair the gap she had created. She had abandoned not only a man who had loved her unconditionally, but a lifetime of trust and shared moments that could never be restored. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, casting light on the dust motes dancing in the air, illuminating the parlor where she had lost so much. Diana closed her eyes and allowed herself to remember, not in fragments or fleeting memories, but in the totality of the love and devotion she had forsaken. She saw her father teaching her the rhythm of the seasons, guiding her hands in planting seeds, showing her the world through patience and tenderness. And then she saw herself leaving, fleeing the weight of responsibility, leaving a man she loved alone in the cold. The realization struck her anew. Cruelty, once enacted, leaves a wound that no time, no distance, no effort can heal. As evening approached, Diana rose and walked through the empty house. Each room spoke to her in silence, every shadow a reminder of what she had forsaken. She paused by the window that overlooked the frozen fields, imagining her father sitting beneath the old oak, cane in hand, eyes searching for her where none could be found. The ache in her chest grew unbearable, the weight of regret pressing her almost to her knees. She knelt on the floor, hands folded in desperation, and spoke aloud, though the house offered no answer. "Father, can you ever forgive me? I have wandered, I have tried to atone, but I know I can never make it right." The words hung in the room, and for the first time, Diana felt the full magnitude of the cruelty she had inflicted. She understood that abandonment is not measured only by absence, but by the void it creates in those who love without expectation, the echoes it leaves across time and memory. The night deepened, and Diana remained in the parlor, wrapped in her own sorrow. She recalled the faces of the people she had helped along her journey, the children she had comforted, the widows she had assisted, the blind man she had guided. Each act of kindness was tempered by the bitter awareness that they could not undo the past, could not repair the man she had left, could not lift the shadow that would follow her forever. Yet she began to see that in her pain, in her relentless regret, there was a lesson that transcended suffering. Cruelty leaves a mark not only on its victims, but on those who enact it, and acknowledgement is the only path toward even the faintest semblance of redemption. Hours became days. Diana remained in the farmhouse, tending what little remained, cleaning, organizing, and in small ways, honoring the memory of the man she had abandoned. She spoke to the empty house, to the shadows, to the wind that whispered through the broken panes. "I remember you. I love you. I am sorry." The words became a rhythm, a ritual, a penance. The cruelty of her past had not vanished, but she had confronted it fully, and in doing so, she allowed herself to begin living with it, instead of running from it. One morning, a neighbor from down the lane arrived with a basket of food. Diana greeted them with trembling hands, explaining only that she had returned to care for the house, to honor a life she had once abandoned. The neighbor nodded, sensing the gravity of her presence but offering no judgment. Diana realized then that reconciliation with the world would never be easy. But acknowledgement, action, and the willingness to live with her regret were the first steps toward the faintest measure of peace. The months that followed saw Diana establishing herself in the township, quietly helping where she could, teaching children, assisting those in need, always carrying the weight of what she had done. The memory of her father's absence remained vivid, a constant companion, but she had embraced it rather than fleeing from it. She understood that some wounds never heal, some cruelty cannot be undone, and some regrets endure for a lifetime, but facing them, living with them, and acting with humility in their shadow was a measure of grace she could offer herself. Years later, Diana would walk past the edge of the fields, now green and alive with spring, and she would pause, thinking of her father. She would whisper into the wind as she had for decades, "Father, I am still here. I remember. I love you. I'm sorry." And though the wind carried no reply, Diana felt at last the faint stirrings of acceptance, a fragile acknowledgement that the cruelty of the past had shaped her, but that remorse, humility, and remembrance could coexist with life. In the quiet of the farmhouse, now warmed by sun and the small comforts she had brought, Diana sat alone in the parlor, hands folded in memory, heart heavy with the knowledge of all she had lost and all she had learned. The cruelty she had enacted had left its mark, and the regret she carried would never fade. Yet she had confronted it, lived through it, and allowed herself to bear it openly. The lesson of abandonment, of love lost and trust broken, would remain with her until her final days, a permanent imprint of a father's love and a daughter's remorse. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Diana whispered one final time, though no one could hear, "Father, thank you for teaching me what it means to love and what it means to lose. I will carry it always." She rose, moved to the window, and gazed out at the fields. The wind carried the faint scent of snow melting into spring, the echo of seasons long past, and in that moment, Diana understood the full weight of her journey. Some cruelty cannot be undone, some regret never leaves, and some hearts remember forever. But living with that knowledge, fully and openly, was the closest she could come to honoring the love she had once abandoned. Her story, her father's memory, and the shadow of regret would continue, entwined forever, a testament to the enduring power of love, loss, and the cost of cruelty.